it. I think that is fair to say. But the idea of celebrating a tragedy that resulted in a man being dead, choked, his last moments being on the floor of a subway, that's someone's son, that's someone's family member, that's someone's beloved family member. The idea that the right is now turning this into the greatest thing, the greatest act of heroism they've ever seen, and they want to give him the Congressional Gold Medal, and this guy, who apparently is Dinesh D'Souza's son-in-law, which maybe says a lot, lauding him and smirking at the death. Your thoughts?
It is amazing to me that you would have someone that choked to death an unarmed man who had mental problems and act as though he's some kind of hero. The clear message is that you are now giving legitimacy to vigilantism, and it could make others feel that they can take the law into their own hand. You get beyond the trial. The jury spoke. People have to accept the verdict of the jury. But to make a folk hero or a political star out of someone that killed an unarmed man who didn't physically assault anybody, who didn't threaten anybody, he was acting unruly. He might have been something that made people uncomfortable in their car. But to kill him and then to honor this person that did this chokehold, that caused the death, and bring him to the president-elect's box at the Army-Navy game, a president that was president when George Floyd happened, Breonna Taylor happened, Ahmaud Arbery happened. He never said a word of comfort to the families of the victims there, but he's going to make this guy, whose only claim to fame is that he choked to death an unarmed man with mental issues. It ought to be an insult to all Americans beyond race. You have to ask, if the race was the other way around, would the reaction be the same? And I think that Donald Trump is clearly sending a racial signal here. And I think a lot of those that have fell in line are comfortable with that. That's frightening.
And how do you feel about that, Max Rose, as a military veteran yourself? Yeah. You know, the idea of him being celebrated at this historic football game that goes back to 1890, this tradition, and the Republicans in that box making this day about him. And to Rev's point, the only reason anyone knows who he is that he choked out a homeless man. And they are now saying he was the star of that day.
Sure. Well, look, Rev is completely right. You know, politicians at all levels, but particularly the President of the United States or the President-elect, have a unique power to shine a light on movements, theories, and, of course, people. And when President-elect Trump was at the Army-Navy game in the center of attention, he had truly an unprecedented moment, at least in the context of the year, to honor living veterans, to honor so many heroes amongst us who have shown incredible bravery and courage in Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts throughout the world. And instead of that, he chose to honor this vigilante who didn't call the police when he was feeling in danger, but instead decided to choke out and kill an unarmed, mentally ill man. That is the last person that we should be establishing as a hero. It is a total disgrace, and it's a wasted moment for the president-elect to actually honor our men and women in uniform, which should be uniting us rather than dividing us.
And what do you think of the fact that in that box, I mean, are a man, Donald Trump, who, according to his former chief of staff, General Kelly, disparaged military veterans as losers and suckers, despite General Kelly's own son having fallen in battle, didn't understand why anyone would serve the military, according to his former chief of staff, General Kelly, did not respect military service, according to his former chief of staff, according to his former Joint Chiefs of Staff chair, is a fascist, according to Mark Milley, and someone who also beside him is the person that he would like to replace Lloyd Austin, a four-star general, but who himself has said it's a Marxist plot at having gay troops in the military, that women shouldn't serve in combat. Sure. He's tried to roll back those comments. What do you make of the people in that box?
Yeah, let's just look at Hegseth, right, who I think is uniquely offensive to men and women in uniform, to those who he is attempting to lead as the Secretary of Defense, because his entire claim is that diversity is what is threatening the military, when in fact it's exactly the opposite. I've deployed to war, and all you have in combat is the man and woman to the left of you, the man and woman to the right of you, and your sense of unity and cohesiveness and trust amongst each other. And any effort to embolden diversity only strengthens that fighting capability. You know, Hegseth says that the President administration are culture warriors that don't care about war fighting, but in fact, that's who he is, because we have never seen a candidate or a nominee for the Secretary of Defense who has ignored traditional military affairs more than him. He wants to talk about women in combat. He wants to talk about diversity. He wants to talk about everything except actually strengthening our military and uniting our nation. And that is why every senator should be opposing him as the nominee for Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, I mean, Rev, I look at that box and I see a very uniform set of men, including J.D. Vance, who I will never forget as long as I live, called our sitting vice president the trash, who called women who don't bear children essentially useless to society and they should have no rights, and men who have shown no respect for women, including Pete Hegseth, no respect for people of color, who just don't, and the people on the field are what is one of our most diverse entities, the military, where anyone can make rank and become someone like Lloyd Austin. It's the opposite of the values. And they are now going to take over. And this is a right-wing, Rev, that has essentially said that the value of your life depends on how rich you are. They're appalled, and should be, that this CEO of United Healthcare was killed on the streets in cold blood. But they think Daniel Penny is Batman, when the guy they worship, you know, Donald Trump is like Bruce Wayne's dad. You know, he's not a champion of the little man. He's not a champion of the little guy. He's Thomas Wayne.
And he showed it in this outing yesterday at the Army-Navy game. He showed that he has no shame at all in trying to stand up for a homeless man with mental problems who's black, having some kind of breakdown on the train. No one's saying, let's get the police. You look at the tape, no one said, let's get the cops. They are sitting there while this man is being choked to death. And you have to ask yourself, is that not a purposeful signal? This is the same Donald Trump that claimed black men were going to vote for him. Well, look at what he did to a homeless black man. What Penny did to a homeless black man with mental problems. We also have a problem of mental illness in this country. Is this how we're going to deal with them? We're going to demonize them and make heroes out of those that would clearly try and take their lives and ultimately did. So there's one thing in the courtroom, it's another thing in the whole public opinion of this country in terms of the populace. Is this how we're going to deal with the mentally ill? Is this how we're going to deal with homeless blacks? I think it's a signal that we need to be clear on. When you look at, as you said, this man that he is nominated, or he's proposing to be the Secretary of Defense, who has clearly shown a real hostility toward diversity, when he himself, if he is confirmed, is the biggest example of white affirmative action. Not qualified, never ran anything, and he's going to be over 3 million people. And J.D. Vance is the one that invites him to be honored at this in this box. J.D. Vance, who, aside from what you said, Joy, let's not forget J.D. Vance accused black Haitians of eating the pets of people in the city in Ohio when he was a senator. So he sees us as animals, and he sees us as less than human.
What a world we're in, and it is probably the most frightening and chilling